Hello, viewers. Good evening and welcome to this episode of Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chaps McFarlane. I would like to apologize for all the inconvenience that we've had this evening with running our show through its regular course, which is through Facebook Live. Nevertheless, we have managed to work things out so that our show today can be run through YouTube. Because we had such an impactful show, we did not want to lose the opportunity to bring you this conversation. Good evening and welcome to this episode of Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chaps McFarlane. I'd like to apologize for all
the... Sounds good.
That sounds good. Okay, so sorry about that. I had YouTube running elsewhere just so that I could make sure everything was on point. As you could hear, everything is on point. That's why you could hear the echoes. But you are welcome to the show. Thank you for joining. If you're joining us on YouTube, I've pasted the link on Facebook and asked some of our viewers to join us. If you also, Mr. Wesley, want to share that link, that would make it convenient for some of the viewers to join us while we are on YouTube. But again, as I was saying, thank you all for taking the time. We are late on starting the show, but it is as a result of some technical difficulties we've had. Nevertheless, because we wanted to bring you this conversation because we believe it is a very impactful conversation, and it comes at a time when we are facing unprecedented events. And certainly, this is a conversation that would uplift your spirit, but would also help you understand the challenges, but also the duty that we as citizens of the world hold at this time in order to engage our political systems, our socioeconomic systems, and also to engage each other as human beings in how we navigate through this system. I would like to let you know that again, this is Unfiltered. I'm your host, Chaps McFarlane. The views, opinions, postings, materials related to this show do not represent the views of my employer or the views of the employer of our guest on this show. They are solely our opinions as citizens and the views of Unfiltered. Let us get right to it. We have an incredible guest here today, Mr. Wesley Petite, PhD candidate, about to complete his dissertation in the next few months, if I may say, but he'll be telling us more about it. Wesley, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you very much for having me, Mark. I really liked how you opened up the episode today. I agree with a lot of what you said about the urgency of us, talking to each other about these things. And also, we're in the middle of a long-term process, so it's really important for us to stay connected with our friends. And this show is a way for us to do both of those. So thanks very much for arranging this.
Well, thank you very much for your patience. You have been waiting since 3:30, I believe, while we try to get this thing on the road. But I really appreciate you standing by and waiting so that we could have this conversation. And certainly, I'm sure our audience is going to benefit from it. Let us, how are you doing, by the way? It's a crazy time, and I feel like we should always check in with each other and say, how are you really doing? How are things?
Absolutely. Yeah. Among the many important questions to ask, how are you doing is no less an important one. And to be honest and to encourage people to be vocal about this, this period that we're experiencing right now has really weighed on me a lot emotionally, with my preceding political engagement and the things that I think the current moment represent and where we could be going. It's definitely been weighing on me, but I am very fortunate to have a good, support system here at home. I'm able to work from home. I have good emotional support with my partner and other friends such as yourself. So I'm doing fairly well and trying to stay positive to make the most of this. And it's kind of a bit of both. You have to be willing to face the harsh realities that are surrounding us, but I think it's important to stay positive and move through them. So I think just taking note of what this moment has to tell us is what will ensure us if we come out of this stronger or not.
I very, very much agree with that. I would go right into the subject of what we are discussing today. I'm just trying to set up my phone via YouTube so I could also observe the streams in case we have any commentaries from our viewers who are watching. I will go about it and I'll present you by going through your bio. You have a very excellent bio. You've done quite a lot of things. And so that is why this conversation with you is a really great one that I've been looking forward to. Wesley Petit currently is the Municipal Food Policy Coordinator with the Ecology Action Center in Halifax, Nova Scotia, here in Canada. He is a graduate with a bachelor's degree honors in political science at the University of King's College, a master's in arts in political economy at the Institute of Political Economy at Carleton University, and is currently pursuing a PhD. He's almost done. I think he's just left to do the defense of his dissertation, which should be done in the next month or so, a few months. Wesley is dedicated to addressing issues of unsustainable food production and deficit in food access. He strongly believes that these efforts must involve in-depth dialogue and processes of learning from the people who are challenged by these issues in their everyday lives. Wesley is a PhD candidate in political economy and political science and has an abundance of experience in activism, civic engagement, and anti-oppressive skills development. Wesley has a specific interest in municipal government and the ability of residents and community organizations to have more direct say in collaborative and participatory approaches to urban planning and resource allocation. Wesley's background in food systems involved dishing out free meals, critical thought with the Carleton University Food Collective, as well as settling the tables for structural change by coordinating research with Meal Exchange. In his current position, Wesley co-chairs the Halifax Food Policy Alliance Steering Committee. The Halifax Food Policy Alliance is a multi-sector collaboration working towards the development of a food action plan for Halifax as part of a global movement calling for municipal governments to recognize food as a public good and key driver in more sustainable, healthy, and a just community development. After completing his MA thesis entitled Participation and Praxis, a study of how participatory budgeting deepens democracy by institutionalizing critical consciousness, Wesley's growing interest in participatory urban redevelopment compelled him to continue his studies. He continues to research on participatory budgeting and theories of democratic urban development, paying specific attention to initiatives such as within Canadian municipalities. Wesley's thesis, his PhD dissertation, is focused on a recent initiative by the City of Toronto to hold participatory budgeting forums within 3 wards of the municipality, wards 11, 33, and 35, which has been approved to continue for the next 2 years. That is the focus of his dissertation, and his dissertation research will investigate whether and how marginalized perspectives are able to broaden debate around urban development through these forums. To this end, Wesley will utilize his training and experience in interviewing and will develop skills in surveying and participant observation. Outside of all of this, he is an engaged community member, active in the community organizing educational programs both within and beyond campus. And you have also worked as a teaching assistant and have taught some courses in political science. That is just a brief summary of your bio. So once again, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thanks very much. I mean, hopefully that didn't take up too much of the episode, but yeah, thanks very much for that bio. And yeah, you know, it's these aspirations that drive me to kind of investigate these things, and we have a crucial moment upon which to engage in that study right now.
Nice. So I think we have some time given the circumstances, so it is not an issue. But let's delve right into it. Wes, what are some of the key factors of the novel COVID-19 experience and its implications that makes this moment a defining one from a socio-political perspective?
Well, that's a great question. I think that really what helps to develop an understanding of what this current moment has to tell us is a few key distinctions. One distinction that I try to make in my understanding of the situation is what's actually new about COVID-19. And on the other hand, what we are currently experiencing is more so the result of legacy or pre-existing issues that are currently under a COVID-19 stress test. So in terms of what's new about COVID-19, I would say that we can all agree that there is the presence of a seriously contagious and potentially deadly disease now present in the world, which compels us to take on different physical practices in order to stop spreading that disease, such as social distancing, physical distancing, quarantines, travel bans, and lockdowns. And so I would say that really a lot of what's new about COVID-19 is highly physical. It's a physical experience. It is a matter of medical science. And something, I think that is actually what really puts the pin on what's new about COVID-19 and this experience we're in right now, which has social implications, but is largely physical. On the other hand, what I would count as kind of the pre-existing socio-political layout that this COVID experience is currently playing out across involves a number of issues, of which I would include precarious trade connections, a lack of a functional social safety net and healthcare system, and rates of inequality that are enforced by prejudicial law. So we kind of think about what's new and what is actually the result of longer running issues currently under a stress test. I would say that this helps us differentiate where problems are arising from. Right. And after having that distinction in mind, I think that we're better able to realize what of the current challenges that we're experiencing arise from COVID-19 itself, and what challenges that are being experienced arise from the emergency responses themselves. Once again, COVID-19 highly a physical, a factual presence in our life, where the emergency responses are more of a negotiated or contingent decision, which varies across settings, as we can see across various emergency responses across different jurisdictions.
Right.
So then in our kind of assessment of these emergency responses, I think that there's one other key distinction to make within those emergency responses. We have the differentiation between essential and non-essential, including services, travel, infrastructure, and workers. And this term essential is a contested term. The thing about essential is it has a natural definition. There is an objective definition about essentials, which is not always aligned with as essentials are recognized in policy. Once again, as demonstrated, how the emergency responses and definitions of essential vary across jurisdictions. So I think that realizing the difference between the physical presence of COVID-19 and the political process by which the emergency responses are generated helps us to really see what's new and what is actually a longer running pre-existing issue. And I think that after making these specific differentiations, we are better equipped and situated to answer the ultimate question of what we're seeing right now is necessary for medical response and emergency recovery. So those would be temporary. And what we're seeing right now is more so the realization of what a just and resilient society entails. And I definitely think that, as we see these politically endorsed or the definitions of essentials as they are embedded in policy, we see the champion level work of community-led networks and social infrastructure, which closes the gap between those contested definitions of essentials and actually demonstrates to us what is necessary to build a more resilient community.
Very, very well said. And I like all of the various themes that you've talked about. So let's explore them a little bit. Is what we are experiencing as a result of this pandemic, the result of existing weaknesses in our political, economic systems of governance and social predispositions, especially in the West, because you talk about this negotiation on issues like on things that we have seen being talked about so much, like essential services, you know. So what is your view of the response and the current state of affairs, given the way the pandemic has caused a lot of disruptions?
Yeah. So yeah, I do focus mainly in the North American context. Of course, the Canadian federal response is directly in the center of my radar, as well as the response by the Nova Scotian government and the community of Nova Scotia. Of course, it's hard to look away from the political theater on the federal level of the United States. And I've also taken note of a few governors of the United States that are playing a champion effort. So yeah, I mainly focus on Canada and the United States. I do think that in the best of cases, the response has been robust, has been direct. You know, in response to the physical implications of COVID-19, we have the shutdown of businesses and public spaces. And this has created a tectonic shift in people's lives. And this fundamental shift in people's lives has been met with actually tsunamis of aid and financial support. I mean, we have the $100 billion bailout package from the Canadian federal government, and multiple forms of aid for businesses, as well as people that are unemployed. Early on, you know, the Canadian government was shown to be developing in its approach, as it needed a reminder that staying at home is not always a safe option for a lot of people experiencing abuse. And so you had the rollout of supports for people experiencing abuse in their home,
right,
and provisions for them. And you, in the similar pattern, you now have the Canadian Emergency Release Benefit spreading, you know, wider and wider to cover more people and make sure people making under $2,500 a month are topped up to a livable income. And you also see some responses within the private sector, increasing pay for, you know, newly celebrated frontline workers of the grocery store staff, you know, keeping shelves stocked in a dangerous, challenging context. You know, Sobeys has its Hero Pay program, and all predominant grocery store chains in Canada have done the same, sort of temporary pay increases for staff. This developing response has continued to be demonstrated in the more recent $100 million investment in food access initiatives to help people that are already under conditions of food insecurity to not be have their problems further exacerbated under these conditions of this fundamental shift that we're living in right now, as well as $100 million to northern communities, I think around a third of which was specifically to ensure food insecurity needs were addressed. And the northern communities are actually, on a provincial and territorial basis, the only place where you have higher rates of food security other than Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia has the highest rates of food insecurity across the country on a provincial basis. Also, in response to some of the supply issues, as well as the importance of food production, you have you know, the initial $5 billion in loans and deferred payments offered to food producers, and the more recent $50 million investment in helping farmers who employ temporary foreign workers, those who are taking the trip to come for the seasonal growing season, in order to finance their period of mandatory quarantine. So there are, you know, a lot of responses. The faucets are definitely on to help people put out these various fires arising from COVID-19, and the collective discourse is also on full show. But you know, my real belief in this situation is that these investments are consistently made around the definitions of essential as they exist in policy, which continue to develop due to community advocacy. And with the definitions when definitions of essentials are contested, you have serious moments of tension and or reconsiderations of what constitutes justice and democratic society. So there is a response, but there's a continuing development of what needs to be responded to. This is not unique to COVID-19, but with the serious physical pressure being experienced in daily life, there are many acute examples that we can point to in terms of those contested essentials.
Right. One of those would certainly be something like initially the government had come out strong and said that the universal child tax benefit would be subsidized, so people per child would receive, up to $300 per child, and that was a direct way to put money into people's accounts directly. But yet, we know that the reality has been that they have gone ahead and enacted all these other programs like the Canada Emergency Benefit response, and still they've pushed something like the universal child benefit, which could go directly into people's accounts up till May. What do you make of such a, I call it haphazard decision making?
Yeah, I think that would be a example of the kind of phrase, I think it's maybe gone through the cycle now, but speed over perfection. So I definitely, like I said, there was an immediate response, I think within the first week of concern, and people were starting to work from home about the financial support. And then of course, the Parliament was recalled for an emergency session to pass that aid. And I was actually really surprised by the amount of dialogue that took place over those emergency plans. They weren't forced through, both in Canada and the United States. They got sent back. That happened in other jurisdictions as well. And yeah, one of the outspoken criticisms of the initial plan was that it didn't put money in people's hands. And so yeah, that was one of those kind of developing responses that came about. And I think that absolutely, in terms of certain provisions that are on paper, such as, $5 billion for farmers. Now on paper that looks great, but when you're the person receiving that aid and it's actually only a loan or a deferred payment, I mean, we're all thinking about the future here, or have to. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, I mean, that's where those provisions are shown to be suboptimal in the actual lives and needs of actual people.
Very well put. So let's delve deeper into this idea of community organizations and activism as necessary to make essentials in policy align with essentials in reality. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, another really interesting thing is seeing how forms of protest are taking place within hospitals, where healthcare workers, being thanked either during press conferences or organized, public applause from balconies or front steps. I mean, healthcare workers are being celebrated, but they are continuing to experience lack of supports and investments and the necessary equipment that they need. And, there's a response to that happening right now, and it's getting a lot of profile. You also have a lot of criticisms around, this essential need to stay at home and this rather narrow policy-supported definition of non-essential travel and what people should be doing to maintain their self-isolation in a sustainable fashion. Not everything can be done online, and I think that there is a more comprehensive way to make self-isolation sustainable rather than the broad, order to stay at home. Maybe as a advocate of community activism and a great admirer of the wisdom that exists in the community level, perhaps I'm a little bit reluctant to admit that broad messaging was necessary for some people that weren't quite taking it as seriously as possible. But there was also many people that were ahead of the beat, that were thinking about the shortcomings that arise from people being obligated to stay home and the impact of many regular places of interaction and business being shut down, and also the pronounced physical vulnerability for certain demographics and all people with this sort of invisible phenomenon that we're experiencing with the possible contraction of an infectious disease. You have some criticism being made of Wisconsin because they were the only of 16 states that went ahead with their primary election. And you had a lot of people that wanted to participate in that election exposing themselves to risks. and pointing out the contradiction in public messaging. This election is happening. It's important. It's a constitutional right. It's an American institution. But there is this current situation where you need to stay at home and be very careful and engage in physical distancing. And that was captured by the media about how confused people were, and how the supports for mail-in ballots are not being invested in. I think that South Korea going to the ballot box is a different situation because you had an advanced response, a well invested in testing capacity to make sure that cases of COVID-19 are identified before they are spread further. And so that creates a different kind of setting for those elections to take place in. So I think that those two things have some specific differences behind them, and South Korea and Taiwan are actually being framed as real the model responses to this outbreak, especially with their proximity to its origin. My focus is on the daily essential of food. And so, I was very tuned in from the very beginning about how are the existing systems of how people procure food going to be impacted by this, and how will they be shifted in order to improve access to food rather than allow those issues to be exacerbated. The daily needs of food is historically connected to democratic uprisings. When you can't afford or find bread, something's wrong.
Right.
And there is this very personal, direct impact that food has on someone's sense of not only their own personal well-being, but of societal, well-being and legitimacy. And so that was something that I have always been interested in, but especially interested in now. It was counted among essentials. And so, grocery stores are one of the places that have not been closed. And very early on, the coverage on food throughout the media has been constant. And one of the first instances of that is a very early press conference among the cabinet ministers and Theresa Tam, and how Christina Freeland, it was before the decision was made to limit border crossings and close that to some degree. It was actually at an early point when some federal ministers were saying, I don't think we need to close the border. That would have a disproportionate impact on our economy, and none of us want that. So we need to be careful about closing the border. Eventually that decision was made. But the examples of why the border needs to be kept open used by Christina Freeland, Deputy Prime Minister, included fuel, medical supplies, and food. And she was very quick to say that food is being imported and exported from Canada across the border, but that's a reason why we need to keep it open. And she phrased it as a lifeline. And so then I started to really think, okay, if the border is the lifeline, how far does that lifeline continue to extend to make sure that food arrives in people's hands?
Wow, that is all on point. And to delve further into this issue, talk to us a little bit about the food security issue, which we know that in the global north, specifically in the North American context, you've highlighted certain circumstances or communities where food security might be a problem. But look at it from a global point of view. Did we need a global strategy going into this pandemic from the start? Once it was understood that this was going to spread very, very fast across the globe in a rapid manner, and governments started taking efforts to protect themselves, their countries, their citizens, was there a need for a global strategy, considering all of the things that you've raised? Food security, we know that the global south suffers a lot from food insecurity issues. You've talked about the response, the engagement, community activists coming together to hold governments accountable. We know that those things can work better in a more organized society than in totalitarian societies. So talk to us about this apparent lack of a global strategy, and rather everybody or each nation taking it into their own hands and sort of trying to fight it within their borders.
Yeah, well, I mean, perhaps this is something that we differ on, which is great for discussion. So let's lean into it. A global strategy, I think, is definitely worthwhile given, just in the way that I think about vulnerable parts of my community here in Nova Scotia. There are many, worse off and even more vulnerable parts of the global community. So of course, I'm mindful of that and the value of a global strategy, which the WHO is definitely trying to keep in mind, and how there are parts of the world that are much worse off than Canada and the United States, specifically because of the a well-established and long-running understanding of Canada and the United States as functioning democracies. They actually take more of my attention because I really want to see how these functioning democracies function on the day-to-day in terms of these long-running issues that I mentioned, as well as during emergencies. So this is actually where my focus is. And rather than a global strategy, I do actually think that there is a need for more localized strategies. I mean, this is where my focus is from the level of community knowledge, community-led networks that experience the physical and social ramifications of high-level decisions in everyday life. So these assurances about the resilience of international supply chains and the regular ways that food is shipped and arrives in our grocery stores and in our communities, those were assurances were given that those were still working. There's along with the very active commentary around food in the media, there are concerns about supply issues. But you have, grocery stores, the government, and, other associations really trying to explain this to people that when you see a bare shelf in a grocery store, it's actually just a demand-based shortage, not a supply-based shortage, meaning that people are buying it quicker than it can be restocked, but within the distribution centers that precede the grocery stores, the supplies are there, sufficient to provide for our needs. Nevertheless, a vulnerability of those regular channels, international and cross-border trade, has triggered a renewed interest in domestic productive capacity. This applies directly to medical supplies, with the very interesting use by Trump specifically of the Defense Production Act to mandate production within the United States of medical supplies. That's quite a political spectrum spanner. I kind of say it like that. And you have similar concerns in Canada. So I don't so much specialize in the production of medical supplies, but with the continued commentary around how producers of medical supplies are now subject to a global scale demand, that's a really interesting thing. And I actually don't see very much reporting being done on the response by these companies that regularly produce these medical supplies. And so it would be interesting to think about what their responsibility is in a time like this. Focusing on food, there is definitely a concern, given the aid to local food producers across Canada, there is a response to making sure that they're supported. And let's not forget that another form of value that flows across borders is labor. With the Temporary Foreign Workers Program, 60,000 of which I believe are regularly employed by Canadian farmers, and how this current moment is slowing down the flow of that necessary labor, skilled labor, to produce the food that will be enjoyed in the harvest coming up. So that will have resounding effects. I've also heard about possible shortages of other farming inputs, such as fertilizer and seeds, which will have a definite resounding impact on food security on a broad level in the future. So you definitely kind of a rethinking of where money needs to be invested and who needs to be doing the investing to make sure that food is still arriving in grocery stores. And also how producers can be more supported, because as we know, that is not the most exciting and lucrative form of employment. It's a lot of hard work and long hours, and many intermediaries that separate us and the producers. So I think that there is this renewed interest in a local purchasing, a local focus to make up for that vulnerability of our regular supply chains. And this also comes with its own set of difficulties.
So just to follow up on what you're talking about, and my question on a global strategy, aren't we experiencing all sorts of tensions between competing values? So, for example, you talk about this renewed focus on local, right? But then you also talk about the need to bring in temporary foreign workers, which are coming from other countries to work in these farms and produce all this food that is supposed to supply the local population. So can we sort of isolate and deal with this issue without a global strategy? Because, for example, in Nova Scotia, 6,500 temporary agricultural workers come in each year. That is just in the agricultural sector. So, and these people come from all sorts of countries, from Jamaica, from Asia, to work on these farms. So if we cannot guarantee that we have successfully contained this epidemic in these countries, or even if we say we're going to use highly effective screening measures to screen these particular folks who are coming, aren't we at the same time exposing these countries to risk, or taking away from these countries the resources that they might also need for their own food security? That's one aspect of it. Then the other side of it is the local manufacturing. You see that as of recent, as last week, the Prime Minister was talking about how they have created a supply chain line, and they were going to be importing, I think he said, 1 million medical certified masks from China, which begs the question, if that is where this whole pandemic originated from, why are we importing masks from China? If we are also saying that we weren't sure about the statistics that came out of China, how they dealt with these things, the response in China, a lot of countries are saying, we couldn't trust China's response. We couldn't get enough data to help us anticipate. Yet, we are going to import masks from them. How does this bode well, in the sense that in the States, they've invoked the Defense Production Act to force companies to do it locally. In Canada, we've seen companies that have volunteered to produce alcohol producing companies producing hand sanitizers, companies changing their method of production to meet the needs. So how do we separate ourselves from this global village that we have created by now, sort of picking and choosing when we focus local and when we go global to bring resources to meet the needs?
Yeah. Okay, so the thing about global arrangements is that they're going to have to be owned by the signing on countries anyway. So I think that really, if there is some sort of coordination effort that is valuable, like I said, to a certain degree, but it's really the degree to which, the countries that are signing on, the governments that are signing on to these things, how well they own them. So that's the real kind of point of analysis that I would focus on. What kind of new practices and forms of investment our countries, federal governments, provincial governments, even let's think about, more of a leadership role for municipal governments. What role are these governments participating in these global programs really going to do? What are they considering? So that's still what maintains my focus. I think that I fail to see the connection because maybe this is just a great example of, kind of a pre-existing social tension that is currently under the COVID-19 stress test, which is, derogatory outlooks towards, China. And that's, a very, very long-running stigma and form of prejudice that's been present in the United States and Canada. And so I think that that's something that we should challenge in this time rather than let it characterize our responses. And I think that those million masks, unless it's a million others coming from China, is actually the return of a favor that Canada did for China in terms of providing emergency response equipment. And then China is reciprocating, which demonstrates this collegial relationship that can take place between nation states at the best of times. At the most collegial times. And so I don't really see the worry about accepting medical supplies and support from China. I think they should be equally involved in the conversation and the solution. And then, yes, the very difficult question of how to really grapple with the problem of a labor shortage on farms, because producing certain materials and goods, such as food on the local level, is possible. Of course, producing a domestic workforce that has the skills necessary to support that, the agricultural sector, is possible. However, there are trends showing that people aren't really interested in that work, which is the reason for the expansion of temporary foreign worker programs. And so it was really difficult for me to think, we can import substitute on food and commodities, but what about these people that are doing really important work for the Canadian economy? And I was struggling with that because I do see the continued need to keep that flow of migrant labor happening in various forms. That's another great example of a kind of a pre-existing issue. These temporary foreign worker programs are very limiting and disrespectful to the people, to the workers that participate in them. Put them at the kind of behest of the employer to a degree which is not tolerated in domestic labor. And so I think that what we need to do is improve those programs. Elizabeth Kwan, I had the benefit of being able to hear her opinion on the matter, and she's a long-running advocate for the improvement of temporary foreign worker programs, and actually says that the solution to our dependence on workers that are in another part of the world and the precarious connections between our economy and their labor is to begin programs that integrate them into the local workforce through residency and citizenship, which then build the strength of the domestic workforce. So not cutting those workers out, but including them in more respectful ways.
So let me ask you this, if you are joining us, fellow viewers, you are watching Unfiltered with Chaps McFarlane, your host. We have Mr. Wesley Petite, PhD candidate, and he's here talking to us about various issues underlying our experiences with the COVID pandemic, whether from a social, political, and economic perspective. So what do you think the general experience of this is going to be in terms of a paradigm shift in our political culture, in the economic systems of the world, I want to say, which is largely capitalist, driven by the Western nations which subscribe to that type of a system? What do you think the effect of this experience is going to be in the way citizens engage with governments post-COVID, but also how the economic systems respond or are changed by the experiences or by the indelible mark left on by COVID?
Yeah, I mean, it's really indeterminate. We're making our contributions to sense making in this current moment, and many other people are trying to do the same in their own way. I think that if you're at the behest of political messaging and the kind of daily news cycle, you can have lots of information, but not a lot of explanation. Mm-hmm. And I think that the proper explanation comes from people's experiences, and it is within the consciousness of people, as well as how they relate with their fellow community members, that the change will happen. And we can talk about global change, but on the local level, that is where change happens. Lots of ideas can be spread across the world, lots of goals can be mounted, but those changes really take place and mean the most with how they change the daily experience of people. Mm-hmm. And once again, I'd like to return to the significance of food and how, I think that it's very obvious to a lot of people that are already very civically engaged or engaged in community organization, know about long-running problems of, lack of the supports for the local economy, as well as social justice issues in terms of food access. So I think that there's really nothing new aside from the physical phenomenon of COVID-19 to these organizations, and continuing to press their elected representatives and other agencies to take more seriously the concerns of both supports for the local economy and for specific issues in social justice. So, with the significance of food, it's very clear to see that it is not COVID-19 that is really, it is in many ways exacerbating how we access food, but there are pre-existing issues that are further exacerbated by the emergency responses themselves.
Right.
And so you have, this selection of essential infrastructure and non-essential infrastructure in some jurisdictions that I've seen, such as BC and Kansas City. You have community gardens designated as essential infrastructure, farmers markets designated as necessary food outlets, similar to grocery stores. In Nova Scotia, farmers markets, we weren't organized enough to ensure that farmers markets as they were currently set up were safe to access or could be logistically feasible. So you did have an investment from the Department of Agriculture in Nova Scotia of $30,000 to the farmers markets of Nova Scotia network to develop online markets. And you have many other people that are developing lists and online resources so that people know where they can locate food and the produce of local vendors. You have many community centers, school breakfast programs, and libraries that are supports for a lot of people that are less well off being closed down as part of this emergency response. And the networks that were involved in those organizations, you have the community food centers around Halifax and around the world that are ready to switch up from a physical, how they were originally set up, to a more food distribution model. So they're able to use those resources that were originally relied on in school programs to then still get to those families that are in need. So these are not new problems, but these are things that community members have been working on for a long time. And this is why we have the presence of food banks in our society. And you did have a $1 million contribution from the Nova Scotia provincial government to Feed Nova Scotia very early on in the response effort. Mm-hmm. You have many other organizations that are pushing for more supports to be noticed in a modification of the emergency response efforts, a more robust form that will make this actually sustainable for people already in need or those experiencing new levels of need, and also working on how we can improve our definition, in our different jurisdictions of essential to actually align with essentials as they are known in reality. And you also have, a lot of people working independently of government, a lot of organizations working independently of government. There's a lot of important work being done in Cape Breton that I've noticed. In the Eskazoni First Nation, they actually declared a state of emergency 4 days before the province because of their known increased vulnerability, as well as a consciousness of self-government.
Right.
You have a food hub infrastructure in Cape Breton. You have the Cape Breton Food Hub that is working so hard to make sure that food is still getting to those that were experiencing food insecurity, and also helping local producers get to market and fare these difficulties. I just had the pleasure of talking with someone involved in the Cape Breton Food Hub yesterday, and they explained a conversation that they had with the Minister of Agriculture in Nova Scotia a year ago, and they were pushing for food hub infrastructure, from farmers markets and distribution infrastructure to strengthen the local economy. And he simply said, well, just go to Sobeys. I mean, just do a deal with Sobeys. We don't need this investment in this infrastructure for a food hub. But now the presence of social infrastructure and the importance of those community connections is on full display. And I think that it actually would be a good research initiative to take on to see the different levels of well-being and difficulties that were experienced across communities that don't have that social infrastructure in those community-led networks and those that do. I think that it's really important for us to not let this stay within the kind of COVID-19 minutes of fame, thinking about this as just an emergency situation. We have so many weaknesses and strengths that were pre-existing in our communities being demonstrated right now. And among those weaknesses is, once again, the definition of essential in government policy not aligned with the definition of essential in reality as it's experienced. You have, like I said, that $100 million in food access initiatives being granted from the federal government. That's important. But as has been shown in so many of these examples that I've been talking about, that money needs to be given to an organization to activate it and to do the right things, to make it work effectively. And so I actually think that we should learn from this and engage in more of a learning process from those communities that are pushing for change, that know what's necessary to create more resilient communities, and embrace them in a leadership role. You even have little initiatives repurposing infrastructure, such as the little libraries that people may see around their neighborhoods being used as food pantries. So this really goes to show that there are, many different scales of community initiatives, and that kind of leadership, I think, needs to be learned from, put in a leadership position. Just one other example to kind of talk about the scale of this community activism is that you have the the Community Food Centers of Canada was able to secure $5 million of that $100 million in food access initiatives. And I had the honor of being involved in securing some of that funding for the mobile food market here in Halifax. Originally, the funding from the federal government was solely for food purchasing and equipment, to keep it capital expenses.
Right.
Don't be paying people for doing this important work. The Community Food Centers of Canada, with the portion that they secured of that, did make 15% available for staff payment, because they know that you need to not only have investments in this infrastructure, but also social infrastructure and the people that energize and activate this social infrastructure. So in many of these ways, you see community-led networks, once again, bridging that gap between what's missing in the government responses.
Certainly, there's going to be a lot of lessons learned from the overall response to this crisis, but lessons, as you have said, that should not tie us or constrain us just to developing efficient response mechanisms in times of emergency. Certainly, it should be helping us develop efficient response mechanisms to citizens' needs as a whole, in general, at all times. Because, as you have rightly pointed out, there are a lot of pre-existing situations that have withstood the stress test of COVID. There are a lot of other situations that haven't withstood the stress test of COVID. So it should be an autopsy that really exposes all of the weaknesses, so that governments can tackle them in a systematic way, and also lean into communities and community activism, especially in this time, as you've said, that is really putting up some of the most vulnerable communities that are going through this period. It's really putting up their needs there. I wanted to ask you one thing.
Well, just one sec, if I could just hold just for a second with your mention of citizens and the importance of citizens. I just wanted to say that there's also non-citizens that need to be taken care of during this emergency, which is another example I had scribbled down of this important gap closing that community-led networks are doing to make sure that we actually have a safe, to decrease deaths.
Yes.
Community-led networks are decreasing deaths, and you have the Mutual Aid Fund in New Brunswick, New Jersey, that's helping to reach out to unregistered immigrants that have no provisions whatsoever. They're not touched by the government provisions, right?
Right.
Community-led networks to demonstrate, again, the need to recognize the health needs of of the threat that coming forward as a sick immigrant, and the fear of deportation that they experience, that just does not equip us for a functional emergency response and recovery effort. And in response to some of these intractable issues that people are actively growing up during this time, you have directly said, quote unquote, from Steve McNeil, now's not the time. And we actually have, active debates continue to close that gap in the time. I agree that there's the importance of having an autopsy after the fact, but at a later date. But you have the UN Special Rapporteur of Human Rights and Extreme Poverty saying there is a need to recognize the increased vulnerability of low-income communities, and that needs to be factored into the emergency response to decrease deaths, and to have a more functional emergency response and recovery. So some of these debates do need to happen in this moment. But yes, I do agree that it is a longer term process in which I really hope that the rigor of government needs to give way to the organic wisdom of human communities. You know, we're on the ground, we're experiencing these things. And I think that we need to gain a consciousness of this in the moment and make sure, once again, that this doesn't just get dismissed away as a period of emergency, but something that exposes a lot of the important strengths and weaknesses in our community. So,
very well said. Do you think we come out of this with a more engaged citizenry?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't answer that question directly. So you already have a lot of engaged citizens as well as residents, and so I think that those already engaged will be, you know, even more encouraged to continue to push those forward, especially with the asset of this extreme level of uncertainty that's been demonstrated during this time, and which spells out the need for change. So they will be able to leverage some of these learning outcomes that we're experiencing right now. And I do think that with more people being touched by the vulnerabilities created by COVID-19 and the stress on existing provisions, brings more people into that feeling of, I think we can do better. And so I do think that with the right learning consolidation and the right communication between community members, I do think that this will be a turning point in many jurisdictions towards a more community-minded and civically engaged populace.
Well, if you've been listening to us, this is Unfiltered, and we've been talking about the impact of the COVID-19, especially on the human experience, particularly as it relates to an area where Mr. Wesley is very knowledgeable about, and that is the food insecurity, and also communities, activism, and how all of these things are supposed to align with how we respond in time of emergencies, not just on policy, but in reality. You wanted to talk to us a little bit about some learning outcomes.
Oh, yeah. Well, I definitely think, you know, what this makes obvious to us is kind of, you know, three kind of important points. Number one is that tools are better than rules. Like I said, you know, this kind of broad messaging about just stay the blazes home, it's not comprehensive, it's not sustainable, and it doesn't account for essentials that people require. I think that, you know, the provision of tools to allow us to continue to connect and sustain ourselves are often provided, it's not new, by, you know, community-led networks. And I think that with the you know, critical consciousness around the need for more comprehensive solutions, those tools are really well modeled by critical groups. So tools are better than rules.
That's a good one. I like that.
Thanks very much. I thought you would. Number two, I think that this is a real moment for us to notice the kind of fitness training in terms of civic engagement that is necessary to determine a more resilient and just future. And so this is our moment to kind of witness the you know, real Olympian level work being done by established community networks, some of which I've already mentioned, and I didn't mention many others, but I'm sure all of us know of something that is being done to close the gaps between government responses and community needs by a community-led network. And I think that demonstrates the importance of those strengths, as well as inspires us to develop those strengths within our community and within ourselves. So fitness training for civic engagement, exercising our muscles, you know, for making sure that we are, you know, a democratic and just society, both during times of emergency and on the day-to-day. The third part is more so of a question around, you know, what everyone believes that the change, what level of change is revealed by the current moment. You know, how we should always be asking ourselves, how not ready were we for this emergency response? Because there are, you know, the possibilities of regular kind of commentary around like this will happen again or something else will happen again. So how not ready were our existing systems to deal with something like this? and how could existing systems be better so as to equip a kind of more of a preventative approach to the extreme fallout that we're experiencing, and how we can imagine a society in which people were not so in need or so close to the brink that extreme investments are necessary in welfare within this emergency situation. But I just think that we can think about how a resilient community can be created. And the difficulty is, like we were kind of talking about, not falling into the local trap. Of course, I think a more locally based strategy and locally based mindfulness is necessary coming out of this. But it's not all local all the time only. There is, of course, your local strategy has to be based around a certain set of values. And it's actually more so those values rather than just the direct kind of situation of how far something is away from you that determines whether or not it's useful. So that kind of goes back to the need to develop a more just and respectful temporary foreign worker program in order to fit into locally based strategies of a resilient community. And I really think that these are something we should think about as they apply to day to day. We can't just allow the emergency to constrain everything. I think that that's much more of a kind of a negative oriented strategy about the next, when will the next disaster happen? Let's think about when the next accomplishment is going to happen. And we can continue to make those, I think, better by organizing on the community level and listening to people's experiences.
Well, that has been a great conversation we've been having. We are at the very end of our time here, but certainly this is just the foundation. We will be having more of these conversations. Like I said, this is akin to us beginning a series. We've laid out foundation. There are certain things I want to push you on that I haven't had the chance, because I wanted you to really lay out the premise of your belief in how we should be tackling this pandemic, using our human experiences and focusing at the local community level. So I would tell our viewers that in the next episodes, we would engage more in debate and conversation, and really pushing on some of those points you've highlighted and exploring other points. But thank you so much for coming on and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom and thoughts with us, and for challenging some of the assumptions and views that are put out there by governments or persons within governments as they respond to this unprecedented crisis. You have some books to recommend to the viewers. Talk to us about that before we wrap up.
Yeah, great. And I'll just respond to your last comment saying it's definitely, I think we've made a good contribution here, and everyone should feel, that they can make similar contributions. It's just like trying to make some sense out of what we're experiencing right now. I really feel strongly that we should turn this expanding safety net into a springboard for a conversation about, how we can have a more resilient community and a just transition towards that level of resilience. And I think that to do that, we need to engage positively. And so synergies are possible. And I just respect and believe in the need for community leadership so much that I really want to situate them in a leadership role. But of course, everyone has a role to play, private sector and large scale governments included. One of the books that I thought could really help us understand, develop our values in confronting situations like this is Joyful Militancy by Nick Montgomery and Carla Bergman. I definitely think that sets out, how we can engage critically in a more positive fashion. I really enjoyed reading it and got a lot out of it, and I'm already a positively oriented, determined activist, and so I think that many people could learn a lot out of that. The other books I guess I would suggest is anything by Bruno Latour. I definitely think he helps us understand how matters of natural science and medical science are translated through a political process and not always done justice to, and are matters of negotiation, like I mentioned about the physical implications of COVID-19, and then the more socially and politically negotiated forms of emergency response. And he recently had a book called Down to Earth, which talked about the specific conditions of climate change and how equipped or not equipped our existing political institutions are to really mount the challenges called for by climate change. And I had a couple other books in mind.
That's fine. We can certainly share those books if you can't think of it right now in our next discussions. But I wanted to point out that one of the benefits, the very real benefits, if I could use that terminology to describe it, that is resulting out of this is that in a sense or in a way, the lockdowns and stopping of all of these activities is actually helping the planet with respect to climate change. If you can, you can say that.
Well, I would say it has been really interesting. I've seen it in press coverage of, the Venetian canals, as well as in my own walk, here around Halifax, how much nature is taking space back up so quickly and healing itself in the absence of regular levels of human activity. And that is interesting and is a reason for us to really qualify our desires to get back to normal, but rather to think about the changes that have been demonstrated for us, which are possible in a time of extreme uncertainty and change.
We'll leave it at that. Thank you, sir, for this wonderful conversation. Fellow viewers, we will be having Wes next on the show. We are going to have a series of conversations on a wide range of issues, political, community-driven activism, advocacy, and a few debates in between those issues. So stay tuned for whenever you see a poster or flyer for a conversation with Wesley. Thank you so much for coming on. Thank you, fellow viewers. If you join us, we apologize for the glitch with the Facebook Live, but successfully we have had that conversation here on YouTube. And I think we look forward to next time. Tune in next Saturday. We are going to be having a great conversation about marriage, relationships, and the guest is going to be my very own wife. And so that should be a very powerful discussion. So I invite you to join us next Saturday for another impactful conversation. Mr. West, thank you very much, and have a great and wonderful evening.
You too.
And similarly to all of our viewers, have a great evening, and we will see you next week on the show where we will be having a conversation with my wife. Thank you.